Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Philosophy 2. This is your video for week 9. I'm sorry that things are a little bit delayed this week. My grandfather passed away yesterday unexpectedly. That just sort of messed up my whole day. Um, I apologize for that. Because of the delay, you can go ahead and turn in your Wednesday assignment on Thursday. I made the assignment that was due on Wednesday now due on Thursday, and that's reflected in Canvas. So that shouldn't be a problem. Hopefully, you started working on the assignment already, so you didn't lose some time because the assignment was in the syllabus and the schedule where it always is. Go ahead and take an extra day since we didn't get our video yesterday. Excuse me. What I'm going to do today in this video, it'll be relatively short. Just typical overview for the week, and then give you a little bit of a rundown of some things I want you to keep in mind as you're reading the chapter. There's some important things that I want you to keep in mind as you're learning about these rules on sources in chapter 4. So let's talk about the chapter a little bit. Chapter 4 is on sources, right? So obviously when we're making arguments, right, and I'm sure we've all done this before, right? When you write papers, right, when you make an argument, it's only going to strengthen your argument if you can support your argument with credible sources, right, or the proper sources that are backing up the claims that you're making, right? So far we've been talking mostly about how to make good arguments in terms of, and what kinds of arguments we can make and how to make good types of arguments, like arguments by analogy, arguments with more than one example, arguments that have reliable premises and a conclusion, right? But yes, also another thing to keep in mind, or what these set of rules are talking about, is how to make sure that the sources you use to make an argument are good ones and strong, that will back up your argument well, right? So the first rule that is talked about in the chapter, Rule 13, is pretty straightforward. Cite your sources, right? Which should go without saying, right? But oftentimes I think when we write papers, when we make arguments, sometimes we tend to get a little bit casual and we say, I once read that this happened, or that this is the case and therefore it must be, right? Which obviously isn't as persuasive as if you say something like, look, this particular person who's an expert in this particular way made this particular claim, and I think that this supports my argument for these reasons, right? So it's whether you're having a conversation with somebody and making an argument, whether you're writing a paper and making an argument, right? It's always going to be it's always going to be a little bit better, right, to make sure that you're citing where you're getting your information from, right? So that should go without saying, right? The next, so that's like I said, pretty straightforward. But the next thing, obviously, is we don't want just any sources, right, to back up the claims that we make. We want to seek informed sources, right? Sources that actually know about the topic at hand, right? Or are qualified to make the statements that they make on a particular topic, right? And so this is Rule 14. Tells us to look for informed sources. Now, one of the things that it mentions in this rule is just because somebody is in authority figure on one subject or an expert in one subject does not make them an expert in every subject, right? So, yes, Einstein may have been a mathematical physicist genius, right? But that doesn't mean that he is a person that we would go to necessarily to ask about, I don't know, something like sociology, right, or psychology, right, or ask about his, or as an expert for politics, right. So just because a particular person is an expert in one field doesn't mean that they are necessarily informed or an expert that we should be citing for any another particular claim that we might be making. And so Rule 14 just says, look, it's important that we seek informed sources, that you look into your sources' qualifications, right? And in doing so, right, in understanding what your sources' qualifications are, you can actually add that to strengthen the evidence for your argument, right? So this person, right, who has been doing research on this topic for a long time, or who is an expert on this topic and because of these reasons, right, or has written these papers and published in these magazines on this topic, right, that says this, right, about this topic, right. That's only going to strengthen your argument, right. And it's important to keep in mind, right, that we don't want to just, again, this kind of goes back to what I was already saying, but sources that are just authority figures, right? So, just because somebody is the president of the United States, right, or, a member of the United Nations, right, doesn't mean that should be necessarily that their knowledge should be counted as the expert knowledge on just any topic, right? Because they're an authority figure, right? We want to seek informed sources. Now, authority alone isn't good enough to justify a source being an informed source, right? Now, the next rule, Rule 15, says not only do we need to look for informed sources, but we also need to look for impartial sources, right? So impartial meaning sources that aren't biased, right? Now, this is tricky, okay? And it's really important to sort of use your best judgment in sort of balancing Rule 14, which is seeking informed sources, and Rule 15, which is seeking impartial sources, right? Why do I say this? Well, obviously, right, when it comes to something like, determining whether you should buy a cell phone case, a $100 cell phone case when you're buying a new cell phone, right? Probably not. The person who's selling you the phone and is trying to add on all these things is probably not the best person to, or the most impartial source to ask whether you should buy a case for your phone or not, right? I've had this experience plenty of times, which is why I'm using it as an example, right? When you buy a new phone and then the salesperson's like, well, you really need to get a cell phone case because, the statistics show, right? They don't really say that, but, it seems to be the case that, as soon as somebody walks out of this thing with their phone without a case, they'll drop it and break it, and then they're coming back, right? It's like, okay, well, is this person an impartial source, right? In the sense that they don't have any stake in what it is that they're trying to persuade me of, right? Or is this person trying to make some extra money because they're a salesperson, right? And therefore they do have a stake in whether or not I agree with the argument or not, right? So in that case, right, you might be like, right, I don't know if this is necessarily a bias or an unbiased source, right? But this can be tricky too, right? Because a lot of times people who are informed on topics are people who have stakes in those topics. And so just because somebody who has a lot of stake in a topic or a dispute about a topic doesn't mean that they aren't a source that we should take into consideration or a source that should be used, right? For instance, right, if I were saying, okay, I want to do some research on the realities of LGBTQ individuals on community college campuses, right? The proper way of going about this wouldn't be, or the best mode of conducting research on this topic would not be, oh, well, I want to avoid any biased sources, so I'm going to talk to all the non-LGBTQ people on campus about what they think is going on campus for LGBTQ individuals, right? That wouldn't make much sense, right? You say, well, wait a minute. No, we actually want to talk to the people who are members of this community who have a stake in this dispute about what the conditions are like, right, in order to ensure that our sources are informed on the topic, right? Like I said, now this can get tricky, right? Because in some cases, right, you might say, this person or the is too invested in the topic in order to give us a proper impartial opinion on it, right? But at the same time, a lot of times people who are invested are the ones who are the most informed, right? So it's really a balance that you have to find when you're looking for your sources, right? One other thing I want to note on this difference between these two, or the relationship between these two rules, is to think back to the other textbook that we're reading, right? And one of the things that the other textbook that we were reading talks about is the way that systems of privilege and oppression function, right, when it comes to knowledge production, when it comes to truth and falsity of statements, or what is considered truth and false of statements, right? So, for example, right, historically speaking, right, if we think about knowledge, if we think about research in terms of these rules regarding impartiality, historically speaking, right, white, cisgendered, heterosexual males, right, historically, right, have been viewed by society as being the most impartial, right? And so when oppressed groups often speak up about the experiences that they're having, right, a lot of times the argument that is made is, oh, well, they're just too invested in this topic. They're not seeing this from an impartial or objective view, right? And so historically, this has been a way that marginalized groups have been silenced, right? And their knowledge about their own realities has been, erased, right? So we have to be really, really careful that we don't sort of value this ideal of impartiality in such a way that we disregard how personal experiences and personal position in the world can really give us an informed perspective on systems of oppression, on the world, on reality in general, right? So just make sure we keep that in mind, right? That historically speaking, those who have been deemed to be the most objective have also been historically the most privileged groups, right? And those who have been deemed to be the least objective are also those that are seen by society as being, are the most marginalized groups oftentimes, right? So credibility is something that increases as your social privilege increases, while your objectivity and impartiality seems to decrease, or it doesn't actually decrease, right? But in society, it's seen as decreasing the more as a member of a marginalized group you are, right? And so this is a problematic, right? This is a problematic assumption about privileged groups versus marginalized groups, right? Marginalized groups are often the groups that have most the most accurate knowledge about the oppressions that it is they're experiencing, right? And the certain realities and ways that social privilege completely blinds us to in some ways, right? So that was a little tidbit I want to make sure that you keep in mind when you're thinking about these rules, right? But obviously, right, seeking impartial sources is important in other regards, right? You want to make sure that there aren't some vested interests, right, that are leading somebody to make the argument that they're making, right, in a way that could make it too biased, right? So yeah, I don't know. My best example is always with salespeople. Like, I don't trust salespeople. I'm like, you're telling me that I really need this, right? But do I really, or are you just trying to make another dollar, right? You seem to have quite a bit of a vested interest in me buying this argument, right? So yeah. So the first set of exercises that you're going to do is exercise set 4.1, which is practice identifying biased sources. So it's going to give you a list of different questions or disputes, right, that you might research on, right? And your job is to think of one source that would not be considered impartial on that topic, right? So one of the questions says, are Macs better than PCs, right? So what would be which would try and think of a source that would not be impartial on this topic, right? Or how much does smoking increase your chances of getting cancer? Who might be a source that you would not want to take into consideration their argument in response to that question, right? Because of potential biases, right? So this is what you're going to be doing when you answer these questions, is thinking of sources that would not be impartial, that would not that could potentially be biased on these topics. Okay, so that's what you'll do there. Then we get to Rule 16. So Rule 16 just asks you to cross-check your sources, right? So similarly, in the way that we should use more than one example in an argument, it's important when we're doing research to rely on a variety of sources to see if those sources and authorities agree on this topic, right? So it's important to ask yourself, are the experts very sharply divided on this topic, or are they pretty much in agreement with maybe a few naysayers on the side, right? And make sure that you are comparing and consulting many reliable, informed sources on the topic, right? Now, again, just to reiterate this point that I think this thread that we see coming out of the other textbook, right? This is also something that we have to take into consideration, given with a eye to the social and cultural structures, right, and hierarchies in our society, right? Because oftentimes people who have been experts, right, again, are members of privileged groups, right? So historically, male doctors have been seen as experts of women's bodies, right? Even though, for many years, right, our knowledge of female anatomy, right, was much more limited than our knowledge of male anatomy, right? One example that I can give of this, right, or one example I can give to kind of support this point is, if you look at older biology textbooks, right? Some of the first biology textbooks that were, and even to this day, right, we still see biology textbooks that have this kind of discrepancies, these kinds of discrepancies. But historically, male genitalia have been portrayed in biology textbooks much more complexly than female genitals, right? So for a while, there was a time where, we have diagrams of the penis that are very intricate and complex and labeled, and then we have the female genitals, right, which we have basically a hole, and that's it, right? Whereas most of us should know by now, right, that there's much more to a woman's genitals than just a hole, right? And so there's actually a really good paper on this that's kind of funnily named Coming to Understand Epistemology of Orgasm. But one of the things that it talks about is the way that the woman's clitoris was not something that was actually portrayed in biology textbooks historically for a really long time, right? Not because it didn't exist, right? But because the people who were experts on this topic, the people who were writing about this topic, right, were viewing the woman's body, right, purely in terms of its purposes, its reproductive purposes, right, and not in terms of this other structure, right, that isn't part of reproductive purposes, right? So the point that I'm trying to make, right, is that yes, it's important to cross-check your sources. That goes without saying. That's an important rule, right? And you want to ask yourself, are experts agreeing about this topic, right? But another important thing to have in the back of your mind, right, when you're doing cross-checking sources is saying, okay, who are these experts, right? What position are they coming from, right? And is there a reason or what? Yeah. So overall, asking what is the position, right, of the people who are considered experts on this topic is a further question that you should ask yourself, right? Because again, sometimes people who are deemed experts on topics or deemed as having the most accurate knowledge on a topic when they actually don't, right? So it's this overarching sort of idea that taking into consideration social, cultural hierarchies is really important, right? And different systems of oppression, right? So again, okay, so that's one point. Another point I want to make about this rule about cross-checking sources is just because there may be some experts or some people who disagree on a topic, right, doesn't mean that the source that is making the claim that something is the case should be discredited or disqualified, right? So, I mean, there's pretty much disagreement on just about everything, right? We still have people saying that the world is flat, right? Just because a few people, or, there may be one scientist out there that says, oh, climate change isn't real, right? But just because there is some disagreement, right, doesn't mean that the sources that are mostly in agreement could not be the ones that are reliable, right, or that we should cross-check, right, or that it should be disqualified, right? So, it's, again, this is another way in which critical thinking is very much more of an art form than it is a science. You really have to get a knack for sort of understanding how to assess whether a source is a qualified one or not, right? And through this cross-checking process, determining, okay, are enough people in agreement on what is the case on this particular topic, right? Or is there, is it just because there's agreement among certain circles, does that necessarily mean that it's the case, right? So in exercise set 4.2, you're going to be looking at a list of examples, and you're going to be thinking of two potential informed impartial sources that you might cite for the argument that's listed, or to answer the question that's listed, right? So one of the questions says, do students do better in class if they take notes with a pen and paper instead of a computer? So your job in this exercise is to think of two potentially informed, impartial sources that you could cross-check and use to answer that question, right? So the 4.1, you're finding sources that are not impartial, that are biased, right? And then in 4.2, you're finding at least two sources that are impartial, right? That are informed, and that can be cross-checked to come to a conclusion about for that question. Okay. Okay, so that's 4.2. And then lastly, we have Rule 17, which is also something I imagine you've heard from other teachers in the past, from other classes in the past, but just this idea that you should use the web with care, right? Use the internet with care. So when you're doing research on a topic, right, it's really important to not believe everything you read on the internet, and to make sure that you are using the proper search engines, right, to do your research, right? So one thing to take into consideration is the way that Google, for instance, right, is not going to. So one thing I often like to mention to students, and sometimes I don't think we really think about this, but one thing to think about is why. So the algorithm that Google uses in order to determine which results come up first, right, versus which results come up last, right, when you search on a particular topic, right, is something that you ought to be critical of, right? Because Google is a corporation, right, that has certain vested interests, right? So when something's listed as being most relevant to your research, is it because it's the most reliable source? Is it because it's the most trusted source on the topic? Probably not, right? So the way that Google organizes what returns to you when you search on a topic, right, is based on Google's own algorithms and their own settings of what the search engine is supposed to kick back, right? And so, right, so think about, I don't know if any of you have ever been on like Urban Dictionary, right? If you go on Urban Dictionary, people like upvote which is the best definition that meets the criteria or that defines the particular word at hand, right? With Google is determining which ones to put at the top, right, and which ones to put at the bottom. And one thing to keep in mind is that, again, this isn't necessarily because these are the best sources on the topic, right? There could be lots of other reasons why it's at the top, right? So this is why it's important that when you're doing research, right, that you try your best, at least when you're online, right, to use use the library's research engines, right? So things like JSTOR, EBSCOhost, right, are good engines, right, that are not going to have these vested algorithms or interests in sort of organizing the way in which you get back information from what you input into the system, right? So it's going to be a lot more reliable to use search engines that are part of libraries and universities, right, than it is going to be to just use a general search engine like Google or Yahoo or something like that, right? Also, right, another way to sort of protect yourself from getting caught up in all of the crap that's on the internet these days is to cross-check the sources that you find on the internet with sources that you find in hard copy books, right, or newspapers or journals, right? So that's another way to sort of add an extra layer of protection to your using the web for your research, right? Because, I'm sure most of you know, right, that you can pretty much find anything to support anything on the internet, right? There's an information overload of people saying all sorts of things about all sorts of topics, right? And so you really have to be careful when you're using the internet as a means to find sources. Okay, so the last thing that you're going to do, so those 4.1 and 4.2, you can turn those in by Thursday, okay? Then we have 4.3, which is, again, similar to the other chapter exercises at the end of the other chapters. You're just going to use the rules from the chapter to evaluate how well each of the following arguments uses the rules from the chapter. Okay, so you're going to be looking at these arguments and saying, okay, how well do they use the rules in this chapter about sources, right? So that's pretty straightforward, and that one's due on Saturday. Okay, and I think you're just doing 1 through 5. All right, and then that's it for this week. Okay, so so make sure you get in your first assignment by Thursday, the other assignment by Saturday. Okay. Also, there's a PowerPoint up on the chapter, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. That's there for your convenience. And I will also post a discussion board if anybody has any questions that come up or points of clarification that they need to make. Okay? So I hope you all have a good rest of the week, and take care. I'll see you next Monday. Bye.